The wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke down from the high ridges as Jed Halverson rode into the dusty main street of Dry Creek. His buckskin coat was worn thin at the elbows, his hat pulled low against the glare. Folks in town knew him only as the Mountain Man, a trapper who came down from the wilderness twice a year for supplies, then vanished back into the timber like a ghost. But this time, Jed wasn't just here for flour, coffee, and bullets. He'd been alone too long. The cabin up in the high country felt colder each winter, the silence heavier. Since the fever took his wife 3 years back, he'd spoken more to the wind than to people. And lately, he'd begun to wonder if the mountains were swallowing him whole. That's when he saw the crowd gathered outside the livery barn. A rough-looking rancher stood on a crate, shouting over the murmurs. Beside him, a woman sat on a stool, her hands bound in front of her, a burlap sack pulled over her head. The rancher's voice cut through the air. "Ain't no man in this town wants her. She's damaged goods, but I'll let her go for the price of a good mule." The men laughed. Some spat in the dirt. No one stepped forward. Jed's hand tightened on his reins. He didn't know why, but something in the way she sat, still, silent, shoulders squared despite the humiliation, made him stop. The rancher sneered. "What's the matter, boys? Afraid of what's under the sack?" Jed swung down from his horse. His boots crunched in the dust as he walked toward them. "How much?" he asked, his voice low but carrying. The rancher blinked, then grinned like a coyote. "For you, Mountain Man? $10 and she's yours. But I warn you, when you see her face, you'll wish you kept your money." Jed reached into his coat, pulled out a leather pouch, and tossed it at the man's feet. The coins clinked. The crowd went quiet. Without another word, Jed untied the rope from the post, took the woman by the arm, and led her away. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But as they walked out of town, the sack still over her head, Jed felt the weight of something he couldn't yet name settling on his shoulders. And deep down, he knew whatever was under that sack was going to change everything. The sun was sinking low when Jed and the woman left Dry Creek behind. The town's laughter still echoed faintly in the distance, carried on the wind like a bad smell. Jed didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead, the reins loose in his hand, his other hand resting near the worn grip of his colt. The woman walked beside his horse, her step steady despite the rough ground. The burlap sack still covered her head, the coarse fabric brushing against her shoulders. She hadn't spoken a word since he'd taken her from the livery. Jed's mind worked over the questions he didn't ask. Who was she? What had been done to her? And why had the rancher been so eager to be rid of her? The trail wound through dry sagebrush and scattered cottonwoods, the air cooling as the shadows stretched long. Jed's cabin lay 2 days' ride into the high country, and the first night would be spent at the old line shack near Willow Creek. As they walked, he noticed small things. The way she kept her chin lifted, even with the sack hiding her face. The way her bound hands didn't tremble. She wasn't broken, not yet. By the time they reached the shack, the sky was a deep indigo, stars pricking through like cold fire. Jed swung down from the saddle, tied his horse, and pushed open the weathered door. Inside, the place smelled of dust and old timber. A rusted stove sat in the corner and a single cot leaned against the wall. He lit a lantern, its glow spilling over the rough-hewn walls. Then he turned to her. "You can sit," he said quietly. She obeyed, lowering herself onto the cot. Jed hesitated, then reached for the knot at the back of the sack. His fingers brushed the coarse rope. But before he could loosen it, she spoke, her voice low, hoarse, but steady. "Don't." Jed froze. "Not yet," she said. "If you see my face now, you might change your mind about keeping me." Her words hit him harder than he expected. There was no pleading in her tone, only a grim certainty, as if she'd lived this moment before and knew exactly how it ended. Jed stepped back, studying her in the lantern light. "I paid for you," he said slowly. but I don't own you. You'll stay as long as you want to. She tilted her head slightly as if weighing his words, then she gave the smallest nod. Outside, a coyote yipped in the distance. Jed moved to the stove, striking a match to light a fire. But as the flames caught, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone out here, that somewhere in the dark, someone was watching. And he was right. Far down the trail, a lone rider sat his horse in the shadows, eyes fixed on the faint glow of the shack's lantern. The man's lips curled into a thin smile. "Found you," he muttered. The fire in the old line shack burned low, casting long, restless shadows across the walls. Jed sat at the table, cleaning his rifle with slow, deliberate motions. The woman, still with the sack over her head, sat on the cot, her bound hands resting in her lap. She hadn't moved much, but Jed could feel her eyes on him through the rough weave of the burlap. Outside, the wind shifted. The coyotes had gone silent. Jed's instincts prickled. Years in the mountains had taught him that silence wasn't peace, it was warning. He set the rifle aside, stood, and crossed to the door. The night was black as pitch, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. Somewhere out there, a horse shifted its weight, the faint creak of leather carrying through the stillness. He stepped back inside, closing the door softly. "We've got company," he said. The woman's head tilted slightly. "Who?" Jed shook his head. "Don't know yet." "But they're not here to wish us well." He moved to the stove, stoking the fire until the flames flared bright. Then he blew out the lantern, plunging the shack into a flickering half-dark. Light from the stove would keep their eyes adjusted, but make it harder for anyone outside to see clearly inside. Minutes passed. The sound came again, this time the slow crunch of boots on frozen ground. Jed's hand went to his Colt. A voice called from the darkness. "Evening, Halverson. You've got something that belongs to me." Jed's jaw tightened. He knew that voice. Clay Rourke, a rancher with a reputation blacker than a mineshaft at midnight. Rourke had a way of getting what he wanted, and when he couldn't buy it, he took it. Jed stepped to the door but didn't open it. "She's not yours, Rourke." A low chuckle drifted through the night. "She was mine the moment I paid for her passage out here." She ran. "You bought stolen goods, mountain man." "I'm just here to collect from the cot," the woman's voice cut through, sharper now. "I'm not property." "Not yours, not his. Not anyone's." Rourke's tone turned cold. "You keep talking, girl, and I'll make sure Halverson here regrets ever laying eyes on you." Jed's grip on the Colt tightened. "You'll have to come through me first." There was a pause outside, then the sound of a match striking. Through the cracks in the wall, Jed saw the flare of light as Rourke lit a cigar. The glow illuminated two more figures behind him, armed men, rifles slung over their shoulders. Rourke took a slow drag, then flicked the match into the dirt. "Enjoy your night, Halverson. I'll be seeing you real soon." The crunch of boots faded into the distance, but Jed knew this wasn't over. Rourke wasn't the kind of man to walk away from something he wanted. Inside the shack, the woman shifted on the cot. "You should have let him take me," she said quietly. Jed turned to her, his voice low but firm. "Not a chance. Whatever you're running from, you're not facing it alone anymore." For the first time, she lowered her head. Not in shame, but in something closer to disbelief. And in that moment, Jed realized he'd just stepped into a fight that could cost him his life. The fire in the stove had burned down to a bed of glowing coals, painting the shack in a deep ember-red light. Outside, the wind rattled the loose boards, and somewhere far off, a lone owl called into the darkness. Jed sat at the table, his rifle within arm's reach, listening to the night. He could still hear Rourke's voice in his head, smooth, venomous, certain. Men like Rourke didn't bluff. If he said he'd be back, he'd be back. And next time, he wouldn't come alone. The woman hadn't moved from the cot. The burlap sack still covered her head, but Jed could see her breathing, slow, measured, as if she were holding herself together by sheer will. Finally, he broke the silence. "You got a name?" There was a pause, then softly, "Mara." Jed nodded once. "Mara, I'm Jed Halverson." She gave no reply, but the name seemed to settle between them like a fragile truce. He leaned back in his chair. "Rourke says you ran from him. That true?" Her hands tightened in her lap. "I didn't run. I escaped." The way she said it, flat, without drama, made Jed's gut twist. He'd heard that tone before from people who'd seen too much and survived it. "And the sack?" he asked carefully. Mara's head turned slightly toward him. "It's easier this way. Men see my face. They change. Some get mean. Some get greedy. Some just look at me like I'm cursed." Jed studied her for a long moment. "I'm not most men." A faint, humorless laugh escaped her. "That's what they all say." The wind outside rose, whistling through the cracks in the walls. Jed stood, crossed the room, and crouched in front of her. His hands went to the knot at the back of the sack. "You can keep it on if you want," he said quietly, "but I'm not afraid of what's under here." For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then slowly she gave the smallest nod. Jed loosened the rope, the coarse fibers scraping against his fingers. The sack slid upward, catching for a moment on her hair before he pulled it free. And then he saw her. His breath caught, not in horror but in shock. Her face was beautiful, yes, but not in the polished way of a saloon girl or a rancher's daughter. It was the kind of beauty that made you look twice, then a third time, because something about it didn't seem possible. Her eyes were a deep, stormy gray, framed by lashes dark as midnight. But across her left cheek ran a pale, jagged scar, the kind that told a story without words. She held his gaze, unflinching, as if daring him to look away. Jed didn't. "That's it?" he said finally. "That's what they're afraid of?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "That scar's the reason Rourke thinks he owns me. He paid for me sight unseen. When he saw my face, he said I was worthless. But worthless things don't get hunted down, do they?" Jed's jaw tightened. "No, they don't." Outside, a branch snapped in the darkness. Jed's head whipped toward the sound. Mara's eyes widened, not in fear, but in recognition. "He's here," she whispered. The sound came again, closer this time. A deliberate step, then another. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to hide anymore. Jed's hand went to his rifle, but he didn't move toward the door. Instead, he glanced at Mara. Her eyes were fixed on the wall as if she could see straight through it into the night beyond. "How many?" he asked quietly. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "3, maybe 4. Rourke never rides alone." Jed nodded once. "Then we make it hard for them." He crossed to the window, eased the shutter open just enough to see. The moon had slipped free of the clouds, spilling silver light across the clearing. 3 riders sat their horses at the edge of the trees, their breath steaming in the cold air. One of them, broad-shouldered, wearing a long duster, was Rourke. The other 2 were lean, hard men with rifles resting across their saddles. Rourke's voice carried easily in the stillness. "Halverson, I'm feeling generous tonight. Hand her over and I'll let you keep your skin." Jed didn't answer. He slid the rifle barrel through the narrow gap in the shutter, sighting on the man to Rourke's left. Mara's voice cut through the tension. "If you shoot, they'll burn this place down with us inside." Jed lowered the rifle slightly, his jaw tight. "Then we don't give them the chance." He moved quickly, grabbing a small burlap sack from the shelf and dumping its contents, dried beans, onto the table. From beneath the cot, he pulled out a battered tin canister of black powder. Mara's eyes widened. "You're making a bomb." "Not exactly," Jed said, working fast. "Just a little persuasion." He poured a thin trail of powder from the door to the edge of the clearing, where the dry grass would catch quick. Then he struck a match, the tiny flame flaring in the dark. Outside, one of Rourke's men saw the spark. "Boss!" The match hit the powder and the line hissed to life, racing toward the clearing. In seconds, a wall of fire roared up between the shack and the riders, the heat pushing back the cold night air. The horses reared, snorting and stamping. Rourke cursed, yanking his mount around. "This ain't over, Halverson," he shouted over the crackle of flames. "You can't hide her forever." The riders wheeled and vanished into the trees, the firelight flickering over their retreating shapes. Jed slammed the shutter closed and turned to Mara. She was still sitting on the cot, but her hands were clenched tight, her knuckles white. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Jed's voice was steady. "Yes, I did." For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the fire outside casting shifting shadows across the walls. Then Mara spoke again, her tone softer. "You don't know what you've gotten yourself into, Halverson. Rourke, he's not just a rancher. He's got half the law in his pocket, and the other half too scared to cross him. He'll keep coming until he gets what he wants." Jed leaned his rifle against the wall. "Then he's going to find out what happens when a man pushes too far." Mara's gaze held his, and for the first time there was something in her eyes other than guarded defiance. It was small, fragile, but it was trust. Outside, the fire burned low, leaving only the smell of smoke and scorched earth. But Jed knew the night wasn't over. Rourke would be back. And next time, he wouldn't just bring 2 men, he'd bring an army. The first light of dawn crept over the ridges, turning the frost on the grass into a field of pale fire. Jed had been awake for hours, packing supplies into his saddlebags with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd done it 100 times before. Mara stood by the doorway of the shack, her coat pulled tight, watching him work. Neither of them spoke much. Words felt dangerous now, like they might carry on the wind and find the wrong ears. When the horses were ready, Jed handed her the reins to his spare mare. "We ride north," he said. "There's a pass through the high country Rourke's men won't risk in daylight. Too narrow, too easy to get picked off." Mara swung into the saddle with surprising ease. Jed noticed it, how she moved like someone who'd ridden before, maybe even lived in the saddle once. Another question he didn't ask. They set off at a steady trot, the cold air biting at their faces. Behind them, the line shack shrank into the distance until it was just another shadow in the valley. For the first few miles, the only sounds were the creak of leather and the muffled thud of hooves on frozen ground. But as the trail began to climb, Mara finally spoke. "You should have left me there, Halverson. You don't know what he's capable of." Jed kept his eyes on the trail. "I've seen men like Rourke before. They bleed the same as anyone else." She shook her head. "No, he's not just a man with a ranch. He's got men in every town from here to the border. He's got sheriffs who owe him favors, judges who look the other way, and he's got a memory like a wolf. Once he's marked you, he'll follow you until you're dead." Jed glanced at her. "Then we make sure he's the one who ends up in the ground." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment, as if weighing whether he meant it. Then she looked away. By midday, they'd reached the lower slopes of the mountains. The trail narrowed, hemmed in by sheer rock on one side and a drop into a pine-choked ravine on the other. The air smelled of snow, sharp and clean. That's when Jed heard it, the faint rhythmic thud of hooves behind them. He reined in, listening. Mara's eyes met his, and she didn't need to ask. They urged the horses forward, faster now, the trail twisting like a snake through the rocks. The sound behind them grew louder. Jed risked a glance back and saw them, 4 riders, dark shapes against the pale sky, closing the distance. "Rourke's men," Mara said, her voice tight. Jed's mind worked fast. The pass was still a mile ahead, but there was a narrow cut in the rock just before it, a place where the trail pinched so tight only one horse could pass at a time. If they could reach it first, they could hold it. They pushed the horses hard, the animal's breath steaming in the cold air. The pounding of hooves behind them was a drumbeat now, steady and relentless. As they neared the cut, Mara suddenly pulled her mare to a stop. "Go!" she shouted. "I'll hold them off." Jed wheeled his horse around. "Not a chance." Her eyes flashed. "You don't understand. If they catch us together, they'll kill you just to make me watch. But if I stay, then you die," Jed cut in. "And I'm not letting that happen." The riders were close now. He could see the glint of sunlight on rifle barrels. Jed swung down from his saddle, shoving the reins into Mara's hands. "Ride through the cut. Don't stop until you see the river. I'll be right behind you." She hesitated, her jaw tight, then nodded once. With a sharp kick, she sent the mare flying up the trail. Jed turned to face the oncoming riders, his rifle already in his hands. He took a deep breath, feeling the cold air burn in his lungs. The first rider rounded the bend, eyes wide at the sight of him standing in the trail. Jed squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked like thunder, echoing off the rock walls. The man tumbled from his saddle, his horse veering off in panic. The others reined in hard, shouting to each other. Jed worked the lever, chambering another round. He wasn't going to kill them all. Not here, not now. But he could buy Mara the time she needed. Somewhere ahead, he heard the faint, fading thunder of her horse's hooves. And for the first time since this began, Jed realized something. He wasn't just protecting her because it was the right thing to do. He was protecting her because losing her now would feel like losing the last good thing left in his life. The echo of the rifle shot still rolled through the mountains when Jed worked the lever and fired again. Another rider swerved, his horse screaming as it bolted into the rocks. The remaining two dismounted fast, using their animals as cover, returning fire with sharp cracks that ricocheted off the stone walls. Jed ducked behind a boulder, the cold granite biting into his cheek. He could feel the thud of each bullet in his bones. He wasn't going to hold them forever, not without Mara. Somewhere ahead, the trail narrowed into the cut. If she'd made it through, she'd be safe for the moment. But if Rourke had men waiting on the other side... A voice boomed from below. "Halverson, you're a stubborn fool. I could have let you live. But now I'm going to take her, and I'm going to make sure you watch me do it." Jed's blood ran cold. Rourke himself was here. The man stepped into view, his long duster flaring in the wind, a rifle cradled in his arms. His eyes were pale and flat like a snake's. "She's mine, Halverson. Always was. You think you're saving her? You're just delaying the inevitable." Jed rose from cover, rifle leveled. "She's not yours. She never was." Rourke's smile was slow, cruel. "You don't even know what she is, do you?" Before Jed could answer, a voice rang out from above the trail. "Tell him, Rourke. Tell him what you did." Mara stood on the ridge, her hair whipping in the wind, Jed's spare revolver in her hand. Her eyes burned with a fury that made even Rourke hesitate. "You paid for me because you thought I was a prize," she said, her voice carrying over the rocks. "But when you saw my face, you called me ruined. You thought the scar made me weak. You didn't know it came from the night I killed the man who tried to own me before you." The words hit like a hammer. Jed saw Rourke's jaw tighten, his grip on the rifle shifting. "You're lying," Rourke spat. Mara's voice was steady. "No, and you're about to find out I'm not afraid to do it again." She fired. The shot tore through the brim of Rourke's hat, sending it spinning into the dirt. He stumbled back, startled, not hurt, but rattled. Jed seized the moment. He fired once, the bullet slamming into the rock at Rourke's feet, forcing him to retreat. The other two men broke, scrambling for their horses. In seconds, the trail was empty except for the smell of gunpowder and the echo of hoofbeats fading into the distance. Jed lowered his rifle, his breath coming hard. Mara climbed down from the ridge, the revolver still in her hand. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. The wind sighed through the pines, carrying away the last traces of smoke. "You saved my life," Jed said finally. Mara shook her head. "We saved each other." They rode on through the cut, the mountains opening up into a wide valley where the river wound silver through the pines. By the time they reached Jed's cabin, the sun was low, painting the peaks in gold. Inside, the fire crackled, warm and steady. Mara stood by the window, looking out at the endless sweep of wilderness. "You could still leave," Jed said quietly. "Go anywhere. Start over." She turned to him, her gray eyes soft but unyielding. "I've been running my whole life, Jed. I'm tired of running. If you'll have me, I'd rather stay." Jed felt something ease in his chest, a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying since the day he buried his wife. "Then stay," he said. Outside, the mountains stood silent and eternal, their peaks catching the last light of day. Somewhere far below, Rourke nursed his pride and his anger, but for now, the world was still. And in that quiet, Jed knew this wasn't just the end of a fight. It was the beginning of something worth fighting for.